In the rolling hills of Kentucky, where the morning mist still clings like breath to the damp bones of forgotten meadows, there stands no town, no monument, no stone to mark the boundary of what once was Pleasant Hill, because Pleasant Hill was never meant to be remembered, not truly, not in the way men remember ordinary places with ordinary sins. For Pleasant Hill vanished in 1834, not in fire, not in flood, but in silence absolute and unnatural, as if the land itself exhaled and erased it from memory. Over 300 souls gone, not a single grave, not a farewell, not even the blackened timber of a collapsed chapel, just stillness, just air, just the ghost of something never fully human to begin with. And while the state of Kentucky keeps its polite distance, sealing the record, as if history could be forgotten by law, the truth never quite stayed buried, not for those who knew where to look or what kind of rot to smell in the soil of that hill, because the rot was not born of natural death, but of something more deliberate, more sustained, more designed. It was not a sudden madness, but a 27-year theater of control, dressed in the garments of sanctity. A performance so thorough, so perfect in its presentation, that even the most devout observers left believing they had touched heaven. What they had touched was something older and colder, and entirely manufactured, and at its center stood a man who was never just a man. Elder Samuel Richardson, the architect of Pleasant Hill, the ordained voice, the supposed successor of Mother Ann Lee, himself carved of scripture and certainty, his voice slow and clear, his eyes the color of wet slate. He had come not to serve, but to colonize, and every word he spoke, every robe he wore, every silence he held, was measured like a scalpel, because he did not need to hurt to kill. He needed only to convince, and he did convince. He built Pleasant Hill not as a church, but as a mechanism, and each convert was not a soul saved, but a cog inserted into something that devoured them and remade them in the Richardson image. And by the time anyone understood what they had become, it was too late and too far to run. He arrived from Ohio in the fall of 1807, wearing dust on his boots and scripture on his lips, claiming a lineage that stretched back to the earliest Shaker prophets, and none dared question it, because when Samuel Richardson spoke, it was not loud, but it was final, the kind of final that closes doors you didn't realize were open, the kind that turns belief into confinement. And he did not walk into Pleasant Hill alone. He brought a family, and not just a family by blood, but a dynasty of purpose. People who didn't just believe in him, but were built by him. Sister Martha, his wife in name, only his partner in something far older than marriage, with eyes that never blinked unless she meant them to, and a voice that could sow calm into panic, and tear resolve from the strongest mind. She spoke softly, never argued, always agreed, and yet somehow always got her way. Then came the children. Brother Ezekiel, with his back like a wall, and his silence like law, who ran the fields not like a farmer, but like a warden, whose eyes could calculate labor like currency, and whose hands rarely got dirty, because others were already trained to bleed for him. Brother Caleb the shadow, who moved through the dormitories at night, listening, cataloging, adjusting, the way a locksmith adjusts tumblers until no one had a private thought. Sister Rebecca, with her warm smile and her weaponized mercy, who welcomed the women, the broken, the desperate, and rebuilt them in 6 months into something new, something obedient, something blank. Sister Patience, with her ink-stained hands, who forged more letters than the state legislature ever saw, mimicking handwriting like a god rewriting the gospel one lie at a time. And behind them all Mother Sarah, the old woman in the chair, who seemed frail, who seemed holy, who never spoke unless it mattered. And when she did, men listened, because her words had already shaped the map before they even knew they were following it. And this wasn't a family. This was an organism. It breathed in secrets and exhaled order. It didn't punish with whips. It punished with silence, with removal, with isolation. That felt so normal that no one noticed when a brother or sister simply stopped being seen, stopped being mentioned, stopped being remembered. And when a new convert arrived, stripped of their name, their property, their voice, they were met with smiles and scripture, and a routine that began at 4:30 a.m. and never stopped, and every hour of every day was designed not to heal the soul, but to break it and reconstruct it into something that could no longer imagine disobedience, because to disobey was to betray God, and God was Samuel, and Samuel was always watching. They said it was holy work, the rising before the sun, the meals eaten in silence, the prayers spoken in circles, the hands pressed into soil and wood and cloth. But what they never said aloud was how none of it belonged to the people who did it not. Their names, not their labor, not even their sleep, because everything flowed back to the Richardson family like tributaries into a poisoned river. Every crop grown, every chair carved, every hymn sung was catalogued, measured, filtered, until it served a purpose that was never spiritual, never pure. And still the outsiders came. They toured the grounds, admired the symmetry, praised the piece, not realizing they were witnessing a performance so well rehearsed it could mimic joy even while it smothered. Yet there were no screams in Pleasant Hill, because suffering there had been refined into something quieter, something more efficient. And it began the moment you arrived, your possessions gone, your letters burned, your past recited to you by someone who had already rewritten it. Sister Rebecca would ask your name and repeat it until it no longer felt like yours. Sister Martha would smile and say, God loves order, and so must we. Brother Caleb would wait outside your door at night, not touching, not speaking, just waiting, so that even your dreams knew they were being watched. And when you began to question even the smallest detail, a missing face, an odd number in the grain ledger, a door you were told not to open, the answers would arrive. Before the questions were finished, carefully crafted from Scripture, and spoken by someone you trusted more than yourself. And if the questions continued, if doubt took root, you would be assigned silence, not by punishment, but by spiritual concern. They would say your soul required solitude, your voice needed stillness. Your meals would be brought to your cell by Brother Ezekiel, who would never speak, but always watch, and the days would stretch like wet rope until you forgot why you ever wondered. And this is how they kept it whole. This is how 300 people disappeared before. They were gone, because disappearance didn't begin with vanishing. It began with forgetting. And when the forgetting was complete, the final removal was only paperwork. And the ledger would be adjusted by Sister Patience, and the name would be written one last time beside a forged letter to a family member who would never respond. And in that silence the record was sealed, and the soul erased, and the chair they once sat in would be filled by someone new who smiled more obediently. It was in February of 1812 when the rhythm broke, not with a scream, not with blood, but with a question, and questions were far more dangerous in Pleasant Hill than any knife could ever be, because a blade wounds the flesh, but a question wounds the system. And the man who asked it was not young, not wild, not someone they could dismiss. He was Brother Thomas Whitman, a merchant once known in Cincinnati for his meticulous ledgers and clear-eyed honesty, a man who had lost his children to cholera and his wealth to faith, who had arrived at Pleasant Hill with calloused hands and a broken heart, offering his estate and his labor and his silence in exchange for something higher. But 5 years passed, and he watched, and he listened, and he counted, because counting was in his nature, and he began to see what others had been trained not to see. He noticed the numbers didn't match the food ordered, did not feed the mouths reported the seed shipments, earned more than was recorded the chairs sold were too few to account for the profits claimed. And he noticed the absences, people who were once there simply were not any more, and no one spoke their names, and no one asked, and no one remembered. And the longer he counted, the colder he felt, as if he were slowly discovering that the warm breath of Pleasant Hill was not the breath of life, but the exhale of something hollow and calculated. So he stood up during the community meeting, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the truth he had measured, and he read from his notes in a voice that trembled and grew as he spoke of the missing dollars and the missing members and the high inconsistencies in every corner of the operation. And as he spoke, the Richardsons did not interrupt. They watched. They shifted. They noted Brother Caleb moved closer to the exit. Sister Rebecca stopped blinking. Sister Martha's knuckles turned white around her prayer book, and Elder Samuel simply smiled, that thin crescent smile that never reached his eyes. And when Thomas asked where the money had gone, where the people had gone, where the truth had gone, the silence that followed was not shock. It was calculation, because Pleasant Hill did not react with fury. It reacted with precision. And what Thomas did not know as he stood there was that his fate had already been decided, and his disappearance had already been written. The only detail left was how long it would take for his voice to fade from the air like all the others. He was last seen walking toward the storage barn just after dusk, his candle barely flickering against the wind. And when the morning bell rang, Thomas Whitman's bed was made. His boots were gone, and no one asked where he had gone, because the question had already been answered before. It was spoken. His name was never mentioned in that morning's prayer. No work assignment was left for him. No portion of bread or root stew was set aside for his return, and those who had once shared meals beside him now bowed their heads a little lower, not in mourning, but in obedience, because everyone knew without speaking that questions were a kind of illness, and illness must be quarantined. And yet the silence was louder than any scream could have been, for in the days that followed certain changes arrived without warning. New locks on doors, fewer names on chore rotations, adjustments in the daily hymns that subtly removed words like free and truth and replaced them with order and grace, and always that same sermon from Elder Samuel about divine unity and the dangers of pride, and how the Lord sometimes removes the selfish to protect the holy. And the more he spoke, the more the others nodded, not because they believed, but because they needed to believe, because the alternative was to see what they had become, and that kind of sight was unbearable. And still Thomas's disappearance was not the darkest part. The darkest part was the drawer in Sister Patience's quarters, the one locked beneath the desk, behind the ledger. Shelves where a dozen letters rested, each written in a different hand, each dated over the last 6 years, each addressed to families in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Virginia, and each one signed with love and peace by men and women who no longer existed, and whose names had been repurposed in the records to mask new arrivals or explain away ration discrepancies, and each letter carefully constructed with just enough personal detail to satisfy a grieving parent or sibling. And none of those families ever came to visit, and none ever wrote back. And in that absence, Pleasant Hill grew stronger, not weaker, because doubt needs contact to survive. In isolation was the soil in which the Richardsons grew their truth and fed it with routine and watched it flower into something so perfect, so pristine, that even those inside it forgot what it had replaced, and as time passed the ledger filled. The graves did not, and every absence was another polished brick in a temple built not for God, but for control. The graveyard was real, but it held no names, just rows of identical markers, carved with nothing but a single spiral etched shallow into limestone, each stone perfectly aligned, facing east, as if awaiting judgment, or perhaps something older than judgment. And the spiral itself was never mentioned in sermons, never explained to newcomers, never acknowledged in any document. But those who lived long enough inside Pleasant Hill knew its shape by heart. They saw it drawn in flour on bakery tables by Sister Hannah, when no one watched, traced absent-mindedly by Brother Isaiah on the side of seed crates, seen once carved faintly into the wood of the altar behind the meeting house. And the spiral did not symbolize resurrection or unity or divine love. It was something older, something buried, something that none of them had ever been taught, but all of them felt. And when Brother Micah collapsed in the fields one summer afternoon, his fingers clenched so tightly around a tuft of grass they had to break them to let go the shape he had drawn in the dirt. Beneath his fist was the spiral again, and it kept happening, not daily, not predictably, but rhythmically, as if something beneath Pleasant Hill was pulsing in time with their routines. And once someone noticed the pattern, they were gone within a week. Sister Abigail, who tended the sick, vanished after asking why the same illnesses appeared every 6 months to the day. Brother Elias, who kept the grain logs, disappeared after realizing the storage barn never emptied, yet records showed regular distribution. Brother Jonah, who read the hymns, stopped speaking entirely after finding a page in the back of the old hymn book that wasn't a song, but a diagram, the spiral again this time. Surrounded by unfamiliar words, not Shaker, not Latin, but something twisted and ancient. And Sister Martha took the book and smiled and told him it was nothing, just an old note from before. And then Jonah was gone too, and no one dared ask again. And deep inside the oldest part of the storage cellar, locked behind 3 doors and 2 decoy passages, there were objects kept under cloths that never gathered dust, books bound in skin, not cowhide, but something finer, tools with teeth instead of blades, and jars filled with things that never floated, never settled, just turned slowly, as if thinking, and those who cleaned that room never spoke again, or spoke only in whispers, or drew the spiral into the air with their fingers before sleep. And some nights when the wind hit right, you could hear the ground hum, not from pipes or roots or wind, but from something beneath the earth, something listening. And still they prayed, because prayer was the only thing left that didn't leave a bruise. But even that had changed. The words were the same, but the cadence was different, slower, deeper, more rhythmic, like a heartbeat felt beneath the floorboards. And the elders said it was the Spirit moving through them. But the oldest converts remembered a time when the air did not feel heavy, when the hymns did not make their teeth ache, when the silence between songs did not stretch so long it felt like something was listening from the rafters. And in those silences, sometimes someone would shiver, not from cold, but from a pressure behind the eyes, a tightness in the jaw, like their thoughts were being rewritten before they even spoke them. And when Sister Ruth began to hum the spiral melody, while asleep the others in her dormitory tried to wake her, but her eyes were open and her lips moved in time with a rhythm that matched the swaying of the lantern above her bed. And when they called for help, Brother Caleb arrived, but did nothing, just watched, just listened. And when morning came, her bed was empty and her belongings already cleared and folded, and no one spoke her name again. And the next day, the lantern in her room was gone, replaced with a new one, identical, but lighter, as if something had been removed. And the deeper you looked, the more it became clear that Pleasant Hill was not preserving faith, it was feeding something, and not in metaphor, not in some vague spiritual sense, but in a way that could be measured in absences and timetables, and how the spiral always appeared after a harvest, after a sickness, after a questioning, and how the disappearances were not punishments, but offerings. And the Richardson family did not see themselves as tyrants. They saw themselves as caretakers, as priests, as keepers of an ancient covenant older than Christ, older than sin, a pact that traded devotion for safety and obedience for power. And the land itself responded to that obedience. The crops never failed, the storms always split before reaching them. The cattle birthed clean and strong, the fires never spread beyond their bounds, and outsiders called it divine favor, and the Richardsons called it balance, and balance required sacrifice, not just bodies, not just minds, but memory itself. And so names were erased, histories rewritten, grief forbidden, because to grieve would acknowledge loss, and to acknowledge loss would break the spell, and the spell had to hold. Because without it, whatever slept beneath Pleasant Hill might wake, and when it woke, it would not ask for prayers, it would ask for blood. It was Brother Nathan who spoke first, not in defiance, not in warning, but in confession, whispered through the slats of a chapel window on a night when the wind did not move the trees, and the stars refused to show themselves. he had returned from. Herodsburg pale, and shaking his clothes too, clean his hands too still, and when asked what troubled him, he only said the names are wrong, and at first no one understood, but he repeated it over and over, the names are wrong, the names are wrong, the names are wrong, until Sister Martha came to his room and sat beside him and held his hand and nodded as if she already knew, and by morning his voice was gone. Not taken by illness, not stolen by fear, but removed cleanly like a page torn from a ledger, and in the weeks that followed his duties were reduced, his meals were lighter, his walks were watched, and eventually he too stopped appearing at morning worship, and his quarters were reassigned to a new convert from Ohio who bore a striking resemblance to a boy who had vanished the previous spring, and no one questioned it because Brother Nathan had left a letter in his own hand saying he had found peace elsewhere, but the signature was crooked and the paper smelled of new ink, and those who had known him best knew he would never have left without his journal, a small leather book filled with dates and names and routes and underlined towns, and in its last pages sketched over and over again in a frantic hand was the spiral, but this time with additions, arrows, dates, small figures standing in line circles, drawn around specific phases of the moon, and in the margin, a single line written in a different pen. The count must be maintained, and no one knew what the count meant. Not exactly, but Sister Patience began sending more letters, and Brother Isaiah began his travels earlier each month, and the births of livestock began to be recorded with more precision than human arrivals, and somewhere beneath the dining hall a new chamber was carved, not with tools, but by something that left no shavings, no sound, only space, where there had been stone. And when the children asked what the humming was at night, they were told it was the spirit breathing through the bones of the earth, and they believed it, because they had no reason not to, because no one had ever taught them how to lie, only how to listen and to obey. And so they knelt each night, with hands folded and eyes closed, humming the spiral melody in perfect unison, while the lanterns flickered above them in rhythm with something ancient and waiting and awake. And then the soil began to bleed, not all at once, not in torrents, but in slow dark veins that rose to the surface like old wounds remembering, where the knife had gone first near the western field where Brother Ezekiel had ordered deeper furrows, then near the boundary trees where no one was supposed to dig, but someone had, and found not roots, but bones polished clean, wrapped in cloth, that bore no rot, and marked with the spiral etched in a way that suggested ritual, not burial. And those who found them were silenced, not with violence, but with elevation. Sister Judith, who wept at the sight of the skull, was made head of laundry 2 days later and never spoke again. Brother Paul, who tried to tell a passing trader, was sent on an extended pilgrimage and never returned, and the land kept producing. The corn grew taller than men, the beans fattened like swollen veins, the herbs that Hannah harvested began to have effects she never wrote down. Some made people sleep so deeply they forgot their names, others made them confess dreams they never had, and one caused a young convert to stare at the chapel walls until her eyes bled and her mouth whispered languages no one recognized, not even Sister Martha, and the next day her bed was empty and her clothes burned, and the spiral appeared scratched into the beams above her cot, and it was no longer a question of what had happened at Pleasant Hill, but what was being summoned, what had always been there, what the Richardsons were, feeding with silence and structure, and rewritten names, and measured deaths. Because it was death, they were measuring not just human, but time itself, time, marked in absences, in cycles, in patterns of sickness and vanishing, and always around the equinox. The ground would shift, the air would buzz, the prayers would slow, and the spiral would be drawn again, this time larger, this time deeper, carved into the grain of the floor beneath the chapel, and coated in a thin black oil that smelled of ash and salt and wet stone. And the elders would say nothing. They would simply kneel and begin. the chant a low harmonic vibration that made the windows sweat and the candles bend, and by morning, something would be gone, a person, a sound, a color from the owl sky, and no one ever remembered what exactly had been taken, only that something was now missing, and in its place. The harvest would double, the water would clear, the wood would stop splitting, and the community would smile and bow and give thanks for a blessing that never felt like a gift, only a trade. There was a door beneath the chapel that no one ever opened, not because it was locked, but because it wasn't. It had no key, no latch, no visible seam, just a black outline, where the stone turned darker and colder, and when you stood near it, your breath slowed, your vision blurred, and the back of your skull itched like someone was tracing their finger along your thoughts. And once during the winter of 1820, a child wandered too, close during evening hymnals, and fell still, staring into the door's surface as if something inside it was speaking only to her. And when Sister Rebecca pulled her away, the child vomited mud and teeth, and her eyes did not blink for 3 days. And when she began to speak again, it was not her voice, it was a deeper voice, older, full of dust and knowing, and every word she spoke was a name, and each name matched someone long buried, and not just from Pleasant Hill, but from towns nearby, from missing persons, reports that had been quietly closed, from headstones dug up by scavengers and forgotten. And when the last name was spoken, the child went silent and never spoke again, and 2 weeks later she disappeared in daylight, in front of 5 people who swore she had simply unraveled into air like smoke from a snuffed candle, and the door beneath the chapel grew darker as if it had fed, and the next harvest was so bountiful it flooded the storerooms and broke the shelves, and rats refused to eat the grain as if it smelled of something wrong. And still the Richardsons smiled, still they preached, still they prayed, and told the others it was God's reward for discipline, for order, for purity. But purity had become a weapon, order had become a chain, and discipline was just another word for silence. Because no one dared say what they saw in dreams anymore. The black water, the spiral fields, the sound of breathing behind the walls, the feeling that their memories were being overwritten, that the faces of their children were slowly changing, that they remembered someone sitting beside them at meals, someone who no longer had a name or shape or space at the table, and the deeper they stared into the life they lived, the more it seemed hollow and staged, like they were inhabiting a replica of Pleasant Hill built over the bones of the real one, and the original still whispered beneath them, still moved in the soil, still watched from behind the chapel door, waiting, patient, constant, hungry, and always listening. It was Sister Hannah who finally broke, not with fire, not with screams, but with a recipe, her hands trembling as she folded the parchment one final time and placed it beneath a jar of dried roots labeled for stomach ailments, though what it contained was not for the body, but for memory, an herb never grown in any known field, whose leaves shimmered under moonlight, and whose root pulsed like a vein, and she had found it growing behind the dormitory wall, in soil that had never been tilled, in a space that should have been stone. And when she brewed it, the tea did not steam, it breathed, and those who drank it remembered things they should not have known, names that had never been spoken, rooms they had never entered, prayers in a language that felt like drowning. And when Sister Hannah drank it alone late one night, her eyes went wide and wet, and she whispered to no one, "It's not a community, it's a mouth." And from that moment she began to change, not in flesh, but in thought, refusing orders, speaking aloud at meals, writing things in margins that vanished by morning, humming songs that reversed the spiral. And one night she boiled a pot of stew that smelled of iron and loss, and fed it to the elders, and watched them eat. And when they stood to pray, their voices fractured like broken glass, and the candles dimmed, and the door beneath the chapel began to seep a thin mist that curled like fingers reaching, and she smiled, not from joy, but from recognition. And the next morning Sister Hannah was gone, not missing, not taken, but removed like a corrupt note from a holy hymn and inner place. A new cook arrived from Illinois, or so they said, but no one remembered her arrival, and when she smiled her teeth were too perfect, and her eyes reflected the spiral, not as symbol but as architecture, something her soul had been built around, and when she stirred the morning porridge, turned counterclockwise, and the air thickened, and the children grew quiet as if some ancient rule had been reinforced, and Sister Hannah's name was never spoken again, and her recipes were erased, and the tea was never mentioned, and still the spiral returned each season in flower, in ash, in the rings of cut trees, in the frost patterns on window glass, as if it had always been there long before Pleasant Hill, long before Kentucky, long before words. And it was not a symbol, it was a signature, a mark of claim, a contract sealed not with ink, but with silence and obedience and bone. By the autumn of 1833, the ground had begun to whisper, not with voices, not with language, but with patterns low rhythmic pulses felt through bare feet as members crossed the chapel floor before morning prayer, a throb like the turning of some buried wheel, steady, constant, ancient, and the older ones, those who had lived through the first expansion, those who remembered the land before the buildings, before the walls, they began to move slower, as if the weight of something unseen had settled onto their bones, and they spoke less and slept more, and their dreams grew so vivid they woke crying without sound, reaching for names that no longer existed. And Sister Martha kept the ledger, but she no longer wrote in ink. She wrote in ash-thin gray, lines that disappeared by morning, and when asked, she said the numbers are not for counting, they are for remembering, and none questioned her, because by then the spiral had become law, not carved, not spoken, but felt in the routine, in the rhythm. In the way, the children walked in circles before sleep in the way. Brother Ezekiel measured the fields in uneven quadrants that made no agricultural sense, but aligned perfectly with something older, something mapped in symbols not found in Scripture. And Brother Isaiah stopped returning from his seed roads altogether. Instead, he sent parcels wrapped in waxed linen, containing not seeds, but soil dark, moist, rich with small white stones, shaped like teeth, and no letter, no explanation, just the spiral drawn in oil on the wrapping. And when they planted that soil behind the chapel, new growths emerged, not plants, not herbs, but stalks of bone, thin curved structures that hummed when touched and bled when burned. And still they prayed still. They obeyed still. They followed the order, because to disobey meant unraveling, and unraveling meant becoming one of the forgotten, one of the erased, one of the countless faces now melted into the hum of the ground in some nights near the winter solstice. The lanterns would not light, and in the dark you could hear footsteps walking slowly up from beneath the chapel. But the steps were not heavy, not human. They were wet and careful, like something blind and listening. And once, in the final days before the disappearance, a group of boys found a passage beneath the eastern barn, a narrow crawl space that led into a chamber of smooth black stone, and in the center a basin-filled knot with water, but with something thick and pulsing. And when one boy touched it, his eyes rolled back, and he began to speak in a woman's voice, a voice that named each of them with names they had never heard, and told them where they would be buried, and what would be taken. And when they returned above ground, they did not cry, they did not speak. They simply walked to their dormitory and lay down and did not rise for 3 days. And when they did, they had forgotten their own names, and the others welcomed them like strangers returning home, and none of them ever spoke of the chamber again. And then came the final morning, a sky the color of split stone, no birds, no wind, just a silence so absolute it made the breath feel borrowed and shallow and wrong. The bell did not ring, and yet everyone rose as if summoned by something deeper than routine, and they dressed in silence, ate in silence, walked to the chapel in silence. And when they opened the doors, they found the pews already full, not with bodies, not with shadows, but with impressions, outlines, and dust, where no one had sat in. Years, and the spiral had grown, and now covered the entire floor, etched into the wood with surgical precision and warm to the touch, and at the center stood Elder Samuel, hands folded, eyes closed, lips moving though no sound escaped, and around him stood the family, every Richardson present, eyes wide and blank like puppets waiting for strings. And Samuel opened his eyes, and they were black, not metaphor, not shadow, but pitch smooth, depthless black, and he spoke not in English, not in tongues, but in a sound that split wood and made blood shiver, and the walls began to bend inward, not crack, not fall, but bend as if the chapel was breathing in, and one by one the members began to kneel, not by choice, not by force, but by necessity, as if their bones had remembered something their minds had never learned, and the youngest began to hum, and the spiral pulsed, and the light disappeared, not flickered, not dimmed, but vanished like it had never existed, and something stepped through the chapel door, not with feet, not with shape, but with presence, a weight, a knowing, a hunger, and those who looked upon it were gone, not dead, not broken, just gone like breath in winter air, and the ledger closed itself, and the pages turned without hands, and the spiral sealed, and by sunrise there was nothing left, no chapel, no bodies, no blood, just empty buildings set perfectly in place, plates on tables, beds made shoes by doors, and yet no sound, no life, no trace, only the wind that returned midday, carrying the scent of cedar and salt and something sweet and rotting, and the spiral still, faint on the ground where the chapel once stood, slowly fading, as if being swallowed by the earth again. And Pleasant Hill was silent once more, and those who found it weeks later dared not touch a thing, dared not speak above whispers, dared not enter the eastern barn, and when asked what they had seen, they would only say nothing, just stillness, just quiet, just a place where nothing lived, and the reports were sealed, and the land was left alone, and the spiral waits, still beneath the soil, beneath the dust, beneath the names no one remembers anymore. But the land did not forget, because the land is not passive. It remembers differently, not in words or stories, but in pressure and heat, in echoes that never fully stop. And so the ground around Pleasant Hill began to change, not visibly, not all at once, but in small ways, that only the careful noticed animals refused to graze within a mile of the chapel's remains, their bodies trembling when they came to. Close birds flew in wide, unnatural circles over the empty dormitories. Insects avoided the soil entirely, even in summer, and those who walked near the site said they felt watched, not seen, not observed, but measured like something beneath. The roots was checking their weight, their warmth, their usefulness, and the spiral began to return, not just in the earth, but in the minds of those who stayed too long. A ranger who patrolled the boundary carved it into his hand in sleep. A historian sent to catalog old furniture traced it unknowingly into the fogged glass of her motel room mirror. A boy from Haradsburg found it drawn in charcoal beneath his bed, though no one had entered his room, and each time it appeared a name vanished from the registry, someone gone, without report, without search, as if the ledger was opening again page by page, soul by soul, and there were whispers in town that the land had begun to breathe again, that at night, if you pressed your ear to the ground, you could hear not dirt, not worms, not water, but breath, slow, patient, ancient, and always coming from beneath where the chapel once stood. And those who knew the old stories, the ones never written, only told over fire and whiskey, remembered that Pleasant Hill had been built on land once feared by the tribes who left it alone, who called it hollow. Ground not sacred, not cursed, just empty of life and full of something else, something that feeds slowly, politely, waiting for order, waiting for names, and now those names are missing. Now the land is hungry again. Now the spiral is returning in carvings, in thoughts and sleep, and those who walk too close forget why they came, and those who stay too long forget who they are, and those who try to dig wake. Up miles away with soil in their mouths and ash in their shoes, and no memory of what they found. And still the state keeps it sealed, still the files remain locked still. The old map carries no warning, only a label written in ink that never fades. Pleasant Hill Shaker Village, established 1807, abandoned 1834, no further records. And beneath that final line in the archive ink, so faint it seems, accidental, there's a mark, not a word, not a signature, but the spiral again, smaller, fainter, tilted, as if watching from the page itself, and no one knows who wrote it or when, and the archivist who found it in 1971 kept it to himself for 12 days, during which his wife reported he would not speak at dinner, would not sleep in their bed, would not respond when spoken to except to whisper numbers, and on the 13th day he walked barefoot to the edge of the Pleasant Hill site and laid down in the grass and never rose. Again, not from death, not from sleep, but from something else, because when they found him, his heart was still beating, but his eyes would not move, and his mouth was fixed open in a smile too wide to be natural, and the only thing in his coat pocket was a map drawn by, hand lines spiraling in on themselves, centered around the chapel's remains with numbers, scratched along the edges 2754-81, and when measured those numbers matched the intervals between major harvests in Pleasant Hill's early records matched the dates of disappearances, matched the timing of moon phases that never aligned until the year the community vanished, and the map now sits in the state archive drawer, locked, marked with a file code that no one uses, and the few who've seen it say the lines shift. When you blink that the paper hums softly, when touched that if you stare long enough, the room begins to pulse in rhythm with your breath, and every now and then someone opens that drawer just to look, just to be sure, and closes it again quickly and locks it tighter and walks outside to breathe, because something about the air in that room tastes too much like cedar and wet stone, and something else older and metallic, like the air before a storm or after a birth. And no matter how long the place stays untouched, the spiral returns, carved into the bark of trees growing where the dormitories once stood, pressed into frost on the library windows, sketched in ash by children who do not know its meaning, who say they saw it in their dreams, who say someone stood in the doorway and smiled and told them to draw, and no one tells them to stop, because when they do, the children do not cry. They simply look back slowly with eyes too focused for their age and say it's not drawing, it's remembering, and the parents laugh and say they'll grow out of it, but they don't, not really, they grow into it, and one day they stop speaking of it and begin walking out into the woods alone, standing still for hours, tracing shapes into the dirt, not looking back when called, and it starts again because it never stopped, and the land was never empty, only waiting. And still the state sends researchers, sometimes interns fresh from university, who believe they are uncovering forgotten history, who carry digital recorders and wide-eyed optimism and wear shoes too clean for soil like this. And each time they are warned gently by the locals to stay away from the chapel ruins, not with threat, not with superstition, just with silence. A quiet too practiced to be accidental, a silence handed down from fathers who remembered the disappearances from mothers, who still dreamed of children they never had, who woke to find dirt beneath their nails and spiral patterns on the floorboards. And when those researchers go missing, it is never immediate, never sudden. They vanish slowly, first in thought, then in voice, then in presence. They begin speaking less, begin writing less, begin standing in doorways with hands twitching to some silent rhythm, and then their belongings are found neatly folded beside the eastern field, and their recorders filled with static and low harmonic pulses that no software can isolate, and the last clear thing captured is always the same sound, a breath, a pause, and a whisper that says deeper and no. One knows what it means, not the families, not the professors, not the local sheriff who stopped opening the reports after the fourth. Missing case ended with an empty footprint, pressed into the mud leading nowhere, and still the spiral comes. It appears now in satellite images, faint heat patterns in the earth that defy logic, visible only in infrared, as if the land itself is exhaling warmth from beneath, as if something is alive down there, not moving, not sleeping, but pulsing, waiting. And they tried to dig once in 1989, a state archaeological team funded by a private grant started excavation near the chapel remains, and the first day uncovered old stone steps leading down. The second day they found a door, not wood, not metal, but something black, something without grain or handle or age. And on the third day the project was shut down without explanation, the funding withdrawn, the dig site filled with concrete, and the lead researcher institutionalized after carving spirals into the padded walls with his teeth. And since then, no permits have been approved, no teams allowed, and the land is considered sacred in all records, not religious, not historical, just sacred. And those who live nearby understand. Without understanding, they keep their distance, avoid eye contact when driving. Past speak softly when the wind turns and cover their mirrors during the equinox, because something walks. During those nights, not seen, not heard, just felt a presence pressing against windows, breathing through cracks, watching through glass. And the spiral turns not forward, not backward, but inward, always returning to itself, always remembering. And the question is no longer what happened to Pleasant Hill, but what Pleasant Hill became, because a village can vanish, but a hunger remains. And this one has learned patience and names and rhythm, and every year the woods grow thicker, the soil darker, the silence heavier, and somewhere beneath it all the spiral still hums, like a clock made of blood and stone and memory, counting down to something that has already happened. And now the children in nearby towns have begun to speak in unison at night, not all of them, not always, but enough to draw attention, enough to make mothers cry, without knowing why, enough to make fathers sit awake at the kitchen table with rifles they never used before, and hands that won't stop shaking. They speak in voices too calm for dreaming, mouths forming shapes they've never learned, saying names, never taught, names of those buried beneath Pleasant Hill, names erased from all records, names spoken only in silence by those who still kneel before the spiral in sleep. And when the children are asked what they remember, they only say it was warm down there, and there were candles that did not burn, and rooms that moved when you prayed. And they say the floor was soft like skin, and the walls breathed, and one girl drew the chapel perfectly from memory, though she had never been within 50 miles of it. And at the center of the drawing was the door, not as ruin, not as symbol, but as mouth, teeth closed tight around a spiral tongue, and behind it figures standing tall and wrong, jointed backward, skin tight and smooth, like melted wax, with no faces, but eyes everywhere. And the drawing was taken by a local priest who tried to burn it, but the flames went cold and the paper turned to ash, without smoke, and reformed itself in the center of his Bible. And when he opened it later that week, the spiral had replaced every psalm, and he was last seen walking toward the eastern woods without shoes or coat, humming the same melody carved into the dormitory floors of Pleasant Hill. And the deeper one listens, the clearer it becomes that this isn't history, it's recurrence, it's infection, it's memory moving through soil and blood and breath. And time has not buried it, only slowed, it only coiled it tighter, so that when it returns, it does so with intention. And those who dream of the spiral do not wake changed. They wake chosen, marked by something older than scripture, older than guilt, older than language itself. And now phones near the site lose signal, watches stop, birds circle and fall dead mid-flight, as if time itself twists near the roots of that vanished chapel. And every attempt to film or document returns static in spirals, drawn into the corner of each frame, etched into pixels, like rot And still people go drawn by something. They don't understand, some looking for truth, others for absolution, and a few for something worse, and none come. Back the same if they come back at all, and when they speak, they do so in spirals. Not word stories that return to their beginnings over and over until you forget where they started, until you forget who you are, until you become part of the spiral. 2. And that's the final truth. Pleasant Hill was never a place. It was a door, and someone opened it, and it's still open. And now the spiral does not wait to be found. It moves outward, slowly, deliberately folding itself into maps, into sound, into light, and thought, and silence. And in certain counties, strange weather patterns have begun to form concentric rings of cloud, and thunder that hover without moving, storms that speak names, and lightning that leaves no fire, only symbols, burned into the earth. And animals stand at the edge of these circles, staring in, but never crossing, as if something in their blood still remembers what the people forgot. And the soil itself no longer sleeps. It pulses and hums and breathes, and people living miles away wake up with dirt in their mouths and ash on their hands, and no memory of how they got there, and dreams are no longer private. They have become shared, a slow bleeding of nightmare across the boundaries of the mind. And those who resist begin to forget things, their children's names, the way their own voice sounds, the difference between yesterday and a story someone else told them once. And in this forgetting something else takes root a hunger, a compulsion to walk to Pleasant Hill, to kneel, to wait. And those who reach the edge of the vanished village do not need to be told what to do. They simply begin walking in circles, eyes wide, hands folded, mouths moving in rhythm with something they cannot hear but still understand. And the spiral welcomes them as it welcomed the first, converts not with fire, not with violence, but with warmth, with light that does not shine, and voices that do not echo, and breath that fills the lungs, not from air, but from memory. And those who step fully into the circle are never seen again, but the fields near the site bloom for days after with colorless flowers that open only at night, and hum in unison with the earth. And in Harrodsburg, they've started to bury their dead, facing away from Pleasant Hill, with salt and iron nailed to the coffins. And still it spreads, not fast, not loud, but constant. And when it reaches your doorstep, it won't knock. It will breathe through the keyhole and whisper your grandmother's name, and ask if you remember the shape of the chapel. And you will, and you won't know why, and you'll draw the spiral on your wall without knowing what it means, and you'll feel comfort in that shape, in that curve, in that return. And you'll forget you were ever afraid, because the spiral doesn't want fear. It wants faith, and it wants order, and it wants you to kneel. And somewhere beneath the oldest oak, near the western slope, where the ground is softest, where no shovel ever reaches the bedrock, something has begun to stir, not fast, not loud, just slow and steady, like the rising of a tide or the breath of a sleeper, coming out of a dream. And the roots of the tree have started to twist downward, no longer growing for water, but following heat, the kind of heat that comes from something alive and buried, something waiting, and the animals won't nest there anymore. They keep their distance, even the insects avoid its bark, and children who play too close begin to whisper secrets they should not know, and always in pairs, never alone, as if speaking the truth requires reflection, and the spiral now appears in their chalk games, in their notebook margins, in the steam on bus windows. And they do not know why, but they say it helps them sleep. And when they sleep, they do not dream, they remember, and what they remember is not from this life, not from this world, not from any scripture or story their parents ever taught them, but from something older than teaching, something built into bone and breath, something that calls itself by no name, only shape. And the ground pulses again on the solstice, and the wind moves through the empty foundations, like a voice through a throat, and those who hear it feel peace, not terror, because Pleasant Hill was not a warning. It was a beginning, not a place, but a pattern, not a fall, but a return, and the spiral turns once. More pulling in thought and time and memory, and those who resist begin to unravel not in pain, but in pieces. The reflection fades first, then their shadow, then their name spoken less and less until it is gone, and when they disappear, they do not. Screen they smile, and those who see them vanish understand without question that something has been completed, something has been balanced, and elsewhere a flower blooms, or a clock resets, or a prayer is answered in the form of silence, and the door. Beneath the chapel, though buried in concrete and salt and forgetting, begins to pulse again once every 7 hours, with no source, no light, no sound, only the pull like gravity, but deeper like memory, but wider like faith, but older, and one day soon. That door will open, not with creaking wood or splitting stone, but with breath, with warmth, with welcome. And when it does, the spiral will no longer hide it, will no longer whisper it, will no longer wait. It will rise from the soil and speak in your voice and wear your shape, and ask if you remember where you came from. And when you say yes, it will take your hand and guide you home. And in the rooms beneath Pleasant Hill that no longer exist, at least not in this world, not in time as we measure it, something still walks, not with feet, not with memory. It moves through echoes that never left stone, through the breath of those long gone, through the names no longer spoken. And each wall remembers the touch of hands that built it, each floorboard remembers a weight of bodies that knelt in silent obedience. And though the chapel is gone, the rooms remain in a deeper layer, in a colder current. And sometimes, if you stand still in just the right place, between shadow and wind, between prayer and forgetting, you can feel the air grow. Thick, not heavy, not wrong, just dense, like something is listening, something that never stopped. And the spiral continues to draw itself, not on paper, not on walls, but inside minds, in sleep, in rhythm, in the spaces between words. And those marked by it begin to change slowly. They forget how to lie. They forget how to look away. They begin to speak only in truths. They never learn truths about soil and hunger and light beneath the earth, truths about voices that come before language. And when they are asked what they mean, they only smile and say, "I didn't say it, I remembered it." And when they are left alone, they hum that same melody, always in threes, always soft, like something being lulled back to sleep or being summoned. And at the edge of the pleasant hillside, the grass has begun to die in perfect circles, patches that align with no natural pattern, patches that move slowly outward, one each month. And inside each patch, the soil is black and warm and humming, and no seeds will take root there. No animals will feed there, and the wind always moves clockwise. And one day someone will dig there, not out of curiosity, not by mistake, but because something told them to, because the spiral needs space, because the shape must be completed. And when that final line is drawn, when the circle is sealed, when the breath returns to the chapel, not as memory, but as form, then the door will open, not beneath Pleasant Hill, not in Kentucky, not even on earth, but in the place you always dream about before waking, with dirt under your nails and a name in your mouth that never belonged to you. And when you speak it aloud, the sky will pause, the birds will fall silent, and the spiral will step forward, and the world will not end. It will begin again. And the ones who feel it first will not be the wise or the faithful or the cursed. They will be the quiet ones, the forgotten ones, the ones who stare too long into still water or listen too closely to the space between heartbeats. They will be ones who walk at night, not from fear, but from instinct, who feel the pull behind their ribs, like a string drawn tighter with each breath. And when the spiral reaches them, they will not resist, because they will already know its shape carved not into skin, but into memory, into the hidden rooms of thought, where language loses meaning and only rhythm remains. And they will speak in spirals and walk in spirals and eat only when the moon tilts right. And when they sleep, they will descend not into dreams, but into the chapel again, rebuilt in darkness, not with stone or timber, but with hunger, with reverence, with purpose, and the door will be there, always open, always breathing, and they will walk through it one by one without fear and never. Return but still be seen in reflections that don't move in shadows, that watch in voices, that finish your sentences with words you didn't mean to say. And when the spiral reaches the cities, it won't announce itself. It won't roar, it will whisper through concrete, through electricity, through the hum of machines, and suddenly names will begin to vanish from databases. Faces will blur in photographs. Families will gather around tables and forget who the empty chair belonged to. And no, one will speak of it because they'll feel it too, the absence, the soft pull inward, the spiral beneath their thoughts. And it will become normal. It will become sacred, and churches will form again in its name, but they will not call it God. They will call it order, and they will kneel without knowing why, and hum without learning how, and the spiral will expand through them, through belief, through silence, through peace, and no war will follow. Only forgetting, only return, and Pleasant Hill will be remembered not as tragedy, not as myth, but as blueprint, as seed, as promise, and somewhere deep below, where the breath of the chapel still rises. Like heat from old stone, something will smile, something that has no face, something that has always been there waiting, listening, and now that the door is open, it will never close again. And when the final name's forgotten, when the last photograph fades, when every birth is followed by a whisper, not a cry, that's when the spiral will surface not as symbol, not as shadow, but as structure, something built into the bones of cities, into the layout of streets, into the way staircases twist, and how windows never reflect what's truly behind you, and the people will not notice, because by then they will have forgotten what it was like to live without the hum. They will think it's the sound of electricity or wind or breath, but it will be memory, the memory of Pleasant Hill, carried like pollen, across time, across thought, across flesh, and even those who resist will only do so once before their names fade from mirrors, from mail, from mouths, and only their absence will remain shaped like a question no one dares ask, and the children born beneath certain stars will already bear the mark, not on skin, but in rhythm, their first steps forming circles, their first words, arriving backwards, their dreams shared like radio signals across distance and bloodlines. And there will be those who still try to map it, who draw diagrams on basement walls, who scribble numbers on bathroom tiles, who mutter geometry into payphones, disconnected for decades, and their hands will shake not from fear, but from remembering too much too, fast from pulling in echoes. Their minds were never meant to hold, and they will disappear. Slowly their speech turning to scripture, their thoughts collapsing into pattern, their bodies folding toward the spiral like trees, growing toward light, and when their doors are opened, all that's left will be soil neatly piled where a spine once lay, and a bullet on the ceiling drawn in oil smoke breath. Or something older, the spiral turning still, as if it was alive, as if it was watching, as if it was waiting, and no one will clean it. No one will touch it, because deep inside they will know it is not an ending. It is an invitation, and those who accept it will walk backward into places no map has marked, into days that loop into names, that echo into the chapel that still stands not in Kentucky, not in time, but in the folds of the world where memory becomes law and silence becomes voice, and the spiral becomes the only shape that makes sense, and those who enter will no longer be called human, but they will not be monsters either. They will be continuity, they will be order, and they will hum. And long after maps have redrawn themselves, and the old names have dissolved into the dirt, and even the word Pleasant has lost its meaning, the spiral will remain, because it is not bound to place or language or memory. It is older than time, and softer than light. It moves where breath falters and thought fractures, and it has no need for believers, only listeners, only those who feel the rhythm beneath their ribs and follow it without asking where it leads, because to ask is to resist, and to resist is to remember, and memory is the one thing the spiral cannot tolerate not true. Memory not the kind that keeps people whole and faces distinct and love separate from obedience. So it coils around those memories and squeezes, gently until they bleed out through the eyes, through the skin, through the spaces between dreams and waking. And those left behind will not mourn, because they will not notice. Not truly, not deeply. They will say strange how the house feels quieter, how the air seems lighter, how the door never closes all the way anymore. And in that quiet, in that emptiness, something will grow, not loud, not fast, just steady like roots in the foundation, like damp on old stone. And when they find the drawings under the bed, carved into dust on the window glass, drawn in steam across the bathroom mirror, they will not clean them. They will stare until their hands begin to mimic the motion, until the spiral draws itself. From muscle memory, from bloodline, from something deeper than inheritance. And when they try to stop, they will feel sick like vertigo, like hunger, like grief. And they will return to the drawing again and again, until it no longer frightens them, until it feels like prayer. And then the dreams will start soft at first, a doorway, a home, a place without light, but not without warmth. And then the voices calling them by names they never told anyone names from before, and in those dreams they will kneel, and the chapel will rise around them, not built, brick by brick, but pulled from inside, outgrown like bone. And inside that chapel the door will wait always, ajar, always pulsing, always breathing, and beyond it not fire, not darkness, not pain, just rhythm, just order, just a spiral completing itself. Again and again, until nothing else is needed, not history, not thought, not self, only return, only completion, only the sound of breath, joining breath and stone, joining stone and voice, joining the voice beneath everything that was ever called sacred, before people forgot what sacred meant. And when the last language collapses under the weight of too many forgotten truths, when the last child draws the spiral without knowing why, and hums the old melody without being taught, when the last chapel is found, not with eyes, but with instinct, carved not from wood, but from memory, that is when the world will begin to bend, not violently, not suddenly, but gently like sleep, overtaking thought like breath, following breath like the sea folding over the sand. And in that bending, everything will shift slightly, just enough that mirrors stop reflecting accurately, just enough that shadows begin to hesitate, just enough that clocks run but no longer measure. Anything you can name, and those who remain will not panic. They will feel peace like they've never felt before, like a hunger, finally met with warmth, like a silence that listens back, and the spiral will no longer hide in corners. It will bloom. In architecture, in DNA, in prayer, in rhythm and the hum beneath the floorboards, or rise in pitch, not loud but clearer, and you will begin to hear your name spoken from cracks in the wall, from teeth in your sleep, from your own voice in another tone, and it will not frighten you, because fear is a tool of the unknowing, and by then you will know what it means to be chosen, what it means to return, and when the air begins to pulse, when your walls breathe with you, when your reflection mouths words you haven't spoken, you will walk to where the chapel always was and always will be, and you will find the door open, not wide, not demanding, just slightly enough for you to slip through. And you will not hesitate, you will step down into the stone, into the warmth, into the hum, into the spiral. And it will close behind you without sound, without resistance, and you will be unmade, not destroyed, not broken, unmade like clay, returning to the hand, like thought returning to the mouth, and in that unmaking you will finally understand, not with words, not with reason, with rhythm, with surrender, with the peace that only comes when everything false has been stripped away, and what remains is not you, but what made you, what carried you, what waited beneath your breath and your doubt and your name, and you will kneel, because there is nothing else to do, and the breath will become yours, and the spiral will stop turning and begin pulsing, and the door will remain open, and the chapel will expand forever. And once the chapel expands beyond place, beyond soil, beyond memory, it will begin to write itself into the bones of the world, not through scripture, not through story, but through shape, through breath, through the rhythm that now hums in the silence, between footsteps, and settles into the pause before a baby's first cry. And those born after the door opened will not need to be taught. They will arrive, already aligned, already humming, already knowing, without knowing, already remembering what their parents forgot. And their eyes will not seek the sky, but the soil, and their hands will not build up, but spiral downward into the earth. And when they speak, it will be soft and slow and without edge, like water speaking to stone, and they will not ask questions, because they will not feel absence, and where absence is gone, there is no need for answers, only continuation, only pulse, only return. And cities will quiet not from death, but from rhythm. Streets bending, subtly buildings leaning, slightly doors built not to open, but to invite, and each home will carry the spiral in its floor. Each breath will follow. The curve each mirror will hold just enough difference to remind you that you are not alone, and when strangers pass in the street, they will not speak, they will nod, they will hum, they will feel the rhythm, pulsing beneath concrete and gravel and bone, and the world will not end, not with fire, not with collapse, not with war, but with alignment, with stillness, with surrender. And beneath it all the chapel will remain breathing slowly, a single inhale stretched over centuries, a single note held in the deepest part of the earth, and above it, trees will bend in circles, roots wrapping like hands around buried names that no longer belong to anyone, but still echo in the soil like promises, in some nights when the moon curves just right, and the wind moves in spirals, and the breath beneath your house deepens. You will wake not afraid, not confused, but calm, and you will walk barefoot to the edge of your room, and you will kneel without knowing why, and you will whisper a name you never learned, and feel something old and warm and endless. Whisper it back, and the spiral will turn not faster, not brighter, just closer, and you will understand that you were never outside of it, only waiting to remember, only waiting to return. And when return becomes the only direction, when the past folds gently into the present, and the future no longer stretches forward, but coils inward like breath held too long, then the spiral will no longer be a mystery. It will be the atmosphere itself. It will be the taste in rain, the echo in empty rooms, the reason you pause when saying your own name and forget why it ever mattered, because by then names will be fragments of what once was tools for a world that needed division. And you will no longer need to divide, only to align, only to listen, only to hum, and there will be no need for fear or faith or hope, because those were scaffolding, and the spiral does not build, remembers it completes, and those who wander the old lands, the fields where Pleasant Hill once stood, will no longer ask what happened. They will kneel in the grass without being told in place, their hands on the soil, and feel it breathe back and beneath their palms. They will feel the hum low and constant, and kind the way a mother sings to what is not yet born, and they will not speak of what they felt, because language cannot hold what was never meant to be explained, and the spiral does not demand relief. It invites erosion, it offers stillness, it pulls like tide, like sleep, like love too ancient to recognize, and those who try to resist will not be punished, only slowed, only turned gently back to the center of themselves. And when they sleep, they will dream of stone floors and candlelight, and doorways made of breath, and beneath all of it, the soft rhythm of something ancient, waiting not with hunger, not with violence, but with patience. And those dreams will bleed into waking until there is no difference, and those who wake in the night and find themselves drawing circles into the sheets, into their skin, into the frost on the window, will not remember starting, but they will finish, and they will feel peace as If some part of them that had been screaming in silence has finally been heard, and then they will hear others humming in the dark, answering without fear, without thought, without voice. Just pulse, just breath, just the spiral remembering itself again. And deep beneath the oldest silence, the spiral continues to turn, not fast, not urgent, only steady, only certain, as if it has always been there. Beneath the rhythm of oceans, beneath the fault lines of the earth, beneath the shallow beat of every human heart, waiting, not for permission, not for recognition, but for exhaustion, for surrender, for the final unraveling of the last lie that you were ever separate from it. And now, even in places far from Pleasant Hill, the signs begin to show. The birds fly in circles until they fall. The insects build their nests in perfect spirals. The roots of trees twist inward and choke themselves, not from disease, but from memory, and people begin waking in fields they have never seen, mouths full of ash palms, carved with shapes they cannot explain, and when they speak, it is slow, it is low, it is not their voice, and still the world does not panic. It adapts, it tilts slightly toward the hum, toward the rhythm, and no one knows why, but everyone begins to walk a little slower, breathe a little deeper, speak a little less, as if conserving something ancient and fragile and inevitable. And those who still try to warn, who speak of history, who cling to doctrine and resistance, find themselves speaking. In empty rooms, mirrors fogged from breath, not their own books missing pages, where names once were prayers losing meaning, as if the spiral has reached language itself, and is now rethreading it from the inside out, and in this rethreading meaning shifts truth, bends memory, becomes unreliable, and still the spiral turns, and in the corners of hospitals and libraries and churches, people have begun to kneel, not from belief, not from fear, but from instinct, as if something is returning that was once taken, or something is awakening that was once buried. And in these moments, the air changes, not colder, not warmer, just fuller, like breath, like presence, like something else in the room, just beyond perception, and those who feel it do not speak. They only hum low and steady, the same note that has always echoed beneath the chapel. And even though the chapel no longer stands in stone, it stands in shape, it stands in mind, it stands in those who carry the spiral, now not as curse, not as salvation, but as design. And when the spiral is ready, it will no longer be seen, it will be known. And when it is known, it will not announce itself with thunder or flame or the breaking of heavens. It will simply be as if it always was, as if the sky always curved just slightly inward, as if the bones in your hand always formed that shape when you were tired, when you were afraid, when you were alone, because the spiral does not demand, it reminds, and once reminded, the body cannot forget the way water remembers the shape of every vessel it's ever touched, and so too will the mind reshape. Around the spiral, not violently, not in resistance, but in relief, because the fight was never against it, only against the echo of forgetting. And now that echo is fading, replaced by a deeper tone, a harmonic below perception that turns every breath into agreement, every heartbeat into reply, and across the earth, those who were never taught begin to write. The same symbols those who never met begin to hum in unison, those who never believed begin to kneel in the same direction, as if the memory was not past, but activated. And those who witness this weep, not from fear, but from recognition, because something inside them has waited so long to return, and now it has. And in the corners of their vision, the chapel begins to flicker, not as ruin, not as dream, but as structure. Whole again, not built, but revealed, and the door that should not exist now exists, and it is not opened by force, but by understanding, by rhythm, by breath. And when one steps through, they do not vanish, they become, they unfold, they spiral. And when they look back, there is no fear, only stillness, only completion, and those left behind will find themselves drawn to that same door, though they do not know where it stands. They feel it in the earth, in the breath of trees, in the wind that never stops circling, and they will follow it, not because they must, but because they were always meant to. And the spiral will guide them without map, without voice, without promise, only pull. Only warmth, only home, and one by one, the world will lean and fold and hum and return. And in the end, when there is no beginning left to remember, and no language sharp enough to separate time from place, and no silence, untouched by the hum, then the spiral will no longer be something that moves, it will be everything that remains. Because it was never a symbol, it was a seed, and Pleasant Hill was not a tragedy. It was a root, a first breath drawn and stolen, ere a pattern etched into flesh disguised as devotion, and every convert, every voice, every disappearance was not an end, but a folding back, a peeling away of the false name, the false light, the false self. And now all those layers have been stripped from the world. The sky no longer pretends to be wide, the ground no longer pretends to be still, and even the soul no longer pretends to be alone, because what began in Kentucky was never meant to stay in soil. It was meant to rise, slowly to awaken inside hunger and ritual and silence. And now it has spread past prayer, past blood, past death, and into rhythm, into instinct, into shape, and there will be no final day, no trumpet, no fire, just quiet, just breath, just the moment you wake up and know you've always been walking in circles, and that the center has never moved, only waited, only pulsed, only called. And when you hear it fully, not with ears, but with marrow, you will feel your hands draw the spiral before your mind understands what it means, and your body will move into it not as surrender, but as memory, and the chapel will rise again in you, in your shadow in your sleep, and it will not ask for worship, only for stillness, only for rhythm, only for the truth that can only be spoken without words. And in that moment you will not disappear, you will not ascend, you will not be judged, you will simply kneel, and the spiral will kneel with you, and the world will exhale and begin.